Hello all, Old Geek here, and this video is about one-shots in role-playing game terms. What are they? What makes for a good one-shot scenario? And does the game system matter? And how should the GM and the players approach them? Firstly, what is a one-shot? In short, it is a short, self-contained game or scenario, usually using pre-generated characters, and usually having little or no impact on any ongoing campaigns. One-shot scenarios are typically those that are used for convention games. They're designed to be completed in a 3 or 4 hour window. But it is perfectly possible in a non-convention environment for a one-shot scenario to expand over 2, 3 or even 4 sessions, depending on session length and speed of play, of course. One shot does not always mean one session. It can do, but it doesn't have to. Outside of conventions, one-shots are usually used by gaming groups to try new game systems, to test new rules, or to provide a little change of pace for a regular gaming group. They can be used to give a regular GM a break, or to help build experience for a new GM. Or, of course, they could be a preferred way of gaming, especially for people who don't have a regular group, or who cannot commit to the time required to run or play in a full-blown campaign. So, what makes for a good one-shot scenario? Well, ideally, the GM should consider the following. Firstly, minimal and simple background material. You will not have time for a lengthy intro to set a scene. You want play to get underway as quickly as possible, and not spend ages on character introductions and the like. Quick, snappy, and to the point. Number 2, there should be a clear and quickly established plot hook. The goal of the characters should be presented to them openly, and it should be a juicy morsel. That does not mean there can't be twists and other shenanigans in the scenario. I mean, whoever or whatever they get the quest from could double-cross them in the finale, for example. It's just that the initial goal needs to be clearly laid out at the very start. And moving on to point 3, that hook, it needs to be meaningful to the PCs from the get-go. Your king has been kidnapped, your village water supply has been poisoned, or that body in the morgue you were just asked to identify. It may have been carrying your father's ID, but it wasn't your father. Something immediate, something that gets the party hooked in straight away. Fourthly, the pre-gens, if you are creating them, and I generally recommend pre-gens for one-shots, they should have personality traits that make them curious, that make them want to get involved, and maybe, for some added fun, personality conflicts with other characters and ulterior motives. Ideally, these should be clearly linked to the scenario that is being played. The 5th point is a quick one. Relatively simple, obvious, and rapid progress. Ensure that the players are aware that things are moving apace, and encourage them to keep up with that pace. And number 6, memorable escalation to a big finale. You want the one shot to end with a bang. Make it obvious, challenging, and most importantly, memorable. Yes, I've used that word again. The players do not need to succeed. In fact, failure often produces the gaming moments that get talked about the most. My first ever game of Call of Cthulhu was a 5-hour Saturday afternoon, early evening game. And my character was the only one to survive, because he had an involuntary bout of madness that caused him to flee to their waiting car, just as his friends were consumed by an horrific entity. It was great fun, but remember, characters used for one-shot games are not typically used again. So go to town. Make the whole thing much more lethal, but do always try to incorporate a clever, logical solution that will enable the most creative and observant players to succeed against the odds. So when running a one-shot, the GM should force the pace, keep the party on their toes, and endeavour to keep the players focused and engaged. And that leads me to focus on the topic of the players themselves. Firstly, the most important one. Engage with the game material as presented by the GM. This is not a campaign. It's a specific scenario, usually with a clearly defined start and end point. So yes, it is likely to be a little linear. Run with it. A while back, I read a forum post from a player complaining about his DM railroading him in a one-shot session and saying that he was a bad DM. Seriously? You're the problem there, mate. Number 2, and almost as important, when using pre-gens, the character's skills and traits will most likely have been made that way for a reason. So lean into them. A good DM will have added them to enhance the scenario and to provoke interesting interactions between the characters. Number 3, be quick and decisive. Your character is expendable. It's a one-shot. But also the scenario is likely to have been designed with firm action in mind. There is no room in a one-shot scenario for a moody edgelord who is unwilling to get involved. So don't play one, and don't make that pre-gen become one. It's neither big nor clever. And number 4, pace of the game, especially in a one-shot, is more important than rigid adherence to game rules. And a one-shot scenario is certainly not the time or the place for any form of discussion on rules interpretations, especially if the game is in an organised space, such as a shop or a convention, where time is limited. So players, no matter how tempted you are, don't. In summary, if you are a player and you go into a one-shot game with the intention of delaying or disrupting the game, and you refuse to accept that it is your responsibility to engage with the prepared material, then you're a bad player, and the hobby doesn't need people like you. Right, with that off my chest, onto the game rule set. I'm a little limited here by the games that I know well, but I'll give a few examples of good, bad, and indifferent game systems for one-shots. Starting with the obvious one, Call of Cthulhu. Horror is a great genre for a one-shot game. I think it's probably the best. And Call of Cthulhu fits the bill perfectly as the game system for this. You ramp up the sanity losses, you force those sanity checks, and you lean into the bouts of madness. And there's a lot of pre-published adventures for Call of Cthulhu that can be played as one-shots, so more of those later. The other obvious one for me, behind me there, is Paranoia. In fact, it's almost impossible to run Paranoia as anything other than a one-shot. Extreme lethality, expendable clones, and the expectation of mass party infighting and constant backstabbing. If the characters survive more than an hour or two without the loss of a few clones, then in all likelihood you're playing the game incorrectly. The missions themselves are nigh on impossible, and should ideally result in everybody trying to blame everybody else for the wanton destruction that occurs. Assuming there's anybody left to take the blame, that is. Now, I've only played one session of this particular game, but I found Index Card RPG to be an entertaining one-shot system. The spotlight shifting sequence keeps people engaged and in the moment, and the fact that the difficulty levels increase in stages throughout the scenes in the game ensures that the scenario naturally builds to a challenging finale. I played one session of it, a 4-hour session, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Now, I may draw a few people's ire here, but I don't generally consider D&D to be a particularly satisfying system for one-shot gaming, not unless the chosen scenario has a specific feel to it. And that feel is high lethality funhouse. High lethality in general. Puzzle dungeons work very well for this purpose. D&D is usually a game of developing stories through exploration and encounters, of slaying fantastical beasts and stumbling upon great treasures, and then telling embellished tales over a jug of mead afterwards. At least for me, that's the style I like my campaigns to be. I've played in a few convention games of 5th edition over the last decade, and to put it mildly, they have all been extremely flat. And that's largely because, certainly in later editions of the game, such as 5th edition, combat can drag out a little, and it's often seen as being a set piece, a slightly predictable end game. Combat in one-shot scenarios really needs to be fast, explosive, and high stakes. I may have been unlucky, but in those game sessions, everything felt overly mechanical. The scenarios were uninspiring, and it felt like the DMs were just going through the motions. I mean, I don't want to be harsh on the DMs, it's partly due to the material and the hand that they were dealt. In one of the games, I was sat there waiting for everybody to have their turn, and everybody was staring at their character sheet and counting themselves on the board. And we were in a library, and I just said to the DM, okay, we're in a library, aren't we? All these bookcases are lined up. I'm going to try and thump that first bookcase and knock them all down like dominoes to try and trap the bad guy at the end. He looked at me, a big smile came across his face. He immediately gave me inspiration. Now, for me, that's not what inspiration is for, but I know he was glad that somebody was thinking slightly outside the box, taking into account the environment and not just the powers that were on their character sheets. Anyway, I digress. My preferred forms of D&D, Basic and AD&D and their retro clones, do work better, in my opinion, than 3rd edition or later for one-shots, because combat tends to be faster and usually more lethal. It's higher stakes. The groups can naturally get more done in a shorter space of time. Plus, those earlier versions of the game tend to have a different style of play. There tends to be more engagement with the environment and much less reliance on the character sheet for listed defined powers. And that works well for the puzzle dungeon environment. Now, of the systems I've played often, those I would avoid for one-shot purposes. Firstly, I'm going to say MERP, Middle-earth role-playing. I like it, but it plays quite slowly. The mechanics can drag out a little, and it's really not suitable for a short game, especially one that is designed to be completed within a defined space of time. And as I already mentioned, I think any version of D&D after 2nd edition. Another game I would avoid for a different reason is the One Ring, as I feel the one-shot setup would fail to do justice to the material. Now, it might be the setting, but both MERP and the One Ring for me are games that need to be savoured slowly, unhurried, like fresh pipeweed, like a Tolkien book. Now, I'm going to end this video with a few suggestions. Published scenarios that I recommend for one-shot games. I'm going to start with Paranoia. Now, I haven't run a lot of Paranoia. I played it a fair bit in my teens, and I've run probably 3 or 4 sessions, so I haven't got a lot of experience of scenarios. But what I did have a lot of fun running was the one that was printed in the Paranoia 2nd edition rulebook. It's called Into the Outdoors with Gun and Camera. It is fairly long for a Paranoia game, but there's a lot to get your teeth into there and a lot of opportunity for comedic moments. And carnage is, well, inevitable. I thoroughly enjoyed running that. For AD&D, I have to pick out S2, White Plume Mountain. You thought I was going to say Tomb of Horrors there, but I would say if you're running a one-shot, S2 is more preferable because Tomb of Horrors doesn't work well within a time limit, in my opinion. It it works well when the players are willing to really take their time. But White Plume Mountain, it has entertaining puzzles, lethal situations, and it is great fun. And if you play it as a one-shot, then that nullifies the potential game-breaking nature of those artifacts, those weapons. It doesn't make much sense as an adventure, but it wasn't intended to. S2, White Plume Mountain, exists to challenge and to entertain, and it does both of those. And for Call of Cthulhu, I'm going to suggest Deadlight. It's very simple, it's very direct, it's very satisfying. It's newbie friendly. A new keeper can run it, and new players can run it. Hasn't got as many moving parts as a number of other more complex adventures do. And there is no option to simply run away or burn everything down. The players have to engage with what is happening. That thing needs to be dealt with. There's tons of flexibility in terms of character types that can be used as pre-gens as well. So it is a really, really good starter adventure, but it's a great one-shot because it is nice and short with a good finale. Recommended. Anyway, I've been the Old Geek. See ya.